Conclusion, Part 2 of the Stones of Venice, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MorganScorpion. The Stones of Venice, Volume 3 by John Ruskin. Conclusion, Part 2. Supposing a modern artist to address himself to the rendering of this tree with his best skill, he will probably draw accurately the twisting of the branches, but yet this will hardly distinguish the tree from an oak. He will also render the colour and intricacy of the foliage, but this will only confuse the idea of an oak with that of a willow. The fruit, and the peculiar grace of the leaves at the extremities, and the fibrous structure of the stems, will all be too minute to be rendered consistently with his artistical feeling of breadth, or with the amount of labour which he considers it dexterous and legitimate to bestow upon the work. But, above all, the rounded and monotonous form of the head of the tree will be at variance with his ideas of composition. He will assuredly disguise or break it, and the main points of the olive tree will all at last remain untold. Now observe, the old Byzantine mosaicist begins his work at enormous disadvantage. It is to be some 150 feet above the eye, in a dark cupola, executed not with free touches of the pencil, but with square pieces of glass, not by his own hand, but by various workmen under his superintendence. Finally, not with a principal purpose of drawing olive trees, but mainly as a decoration of the cupola, there is to be an olive tree beside each apostle, and their stems are to be the chief lines which divide the dome. He therefore at once gives up the irregular twisting of the boughs hither and thither, but he will not give up their fibres. Other trees have irregular and fantastic branches, but the knitted cordage of fibres is the olive's own. Again, were he to draw their leaves of their natural size, they would be so small that their forms would be invisible in the darkness. And were he to draw them so large as that their shape might be seen, they would look like laurel instead of olive. So he arranges them in small clusters of 5 each, nearly of the shape which the Byzantines give to the petals of the lily, but elongated so as to give the idea of leafage upon a spray. And these clusters, his object always, be it remembered, being decoration, not less than representation, he arranges symmetrically on each side of his branches, laying the whole on a dark ground most truly suggestive of the heavy rounded mass of the tree, which in its turn is relieved against the gold of the cupola. Lastly comes the question respecting the fruit. The whole power and honour of the olive is in its fruit, and unless that be represented, nothing is represented. But if the berries were coloured black or green, they would be totally invisible; if of any other colour, utterly unnatural, and violence would be done to the whole conception. There is but one conceivable means of showing them, namely to represent them as golden. For the idea of golden fruit of various kinds was already familiar to the mind, as in the apples of the Hesperides, without any violence to the distinctive conception of the fruit itself. So the mosaicist introduced small round golden berries into the dark ground between each leaf, and his work was done. On the opposite plate, the uppermost figure on the left is a tolerably faithful representation of the general effect of one of these decorative olive trees. The figure on the right is the head of the tree alone, showing the leaf clusters, berries, and interlacing of the boughs as they leave the stem. Each bough is connected with a separate line of fibre in the trunk, and the junctions of the arms and stem are indicated, down to the very root of the tree, with a truth in structure which may well put to shame the tree anatomy of modern times. The white branching figures upon the serpentine band below are 2 of the clusters of flowers which form the background of a mosaic in the atrium. I have printed the whole plate in blue, because that colour approaches more nearly than black to the distant effect of the mosaics, of which the darker portions are generally composed of blue in greater quantity than any other color. But the waved background in this instance is of various shades of blue and green alternately, with one narrow black band to give it force, the whole being intended to represent the distant effect and color of deep grass, and the wavy line to express its bending motion, just as the same symbol is used to represent the waves of water. Then the two white clusters are representative of the distinctly visible herbage close to the spectator, having buds and flowers of two kinds, springing in one case out of the midst of twisted grass, and in the other out of their own proper leaves, the clusters being kept each so distinctly symmetrical as to form, when set side by side, an ornamental border of perfect architectural severity, and yet each cluster different from the next, and every flower and bud and knot of grass varied in form and thought. The way the mosaic tesserae are arranged, so as to give the writhing of the grass blades round the stalks of the flowers, is exceedingly fine. The tree circles below are examples of still more severely conventional forms, adopted, on principle, when the decoration is to be in white and gold, instead of colour, these ornaments being cut in white marble on the outside of the church, and the ground laid in with gold, though necessarily here represented, like the rest of the plate, in blue. And it is exceedingly interesting to see how the noble work, the moment he is restricted to more conventional materials, retires into more conventional forms, and reduces his various leafage into symmetry, now nearly perfect. Yet observe, in the central figure, where the symbolic meaning of the vegetation beside the cross required it to be more distinctly indicated, he has given it life and growth by throwing it into unequal curves on the opposite sides. I believe the reader will now see that in these mosaics, which the careless traveller is in the habit of passing by with contempt, there is a depth of feeling and of meaning greater than in most of the best sketches from nature of modern times, and, without entering into any question whether these conventional representations are as good as, under the required limitations, it was possible to render them, they are at all events good enough completely to illustrate that mode of symbolical expression which appears altogether to thought, and in no wise trusts to realization. And little as, in the present state of our schools, such an assertion is likely to be believed, the fact is that this kind of expression is the only one allowable in noble art. I pray the reader to have patience with me for a few moments. I do not mean that no art is noble but Byzantine mosaic, but no art is noble which in any wise depends upon direct imitation for its effect upon the mind. This was asserted in the opening chapters of Modern Painters, but not upon the highest grounds. The results at which we have now arrived in our investigation of early art will enable me to place it on a loftier and firmer foundation. We have just seen that all great art is the work of the whole living creature, body and soul, and chiefly of the soul. But it is not only the work of the whole creature, it likewise addresses the whole creature. That in which the perfect being speaks must also have the perfect being to listen. I am not to spend my utmost spirit, and give all my strength and life to my work, while you, spectator or hearer, will give me only the attention of half your soul. You must be all mine, as I am all yours. It is the only condition on which we can meet each other. All your faculties, all that is in you of greatest and best, must be awake in you, or I have no reward. The painter is not to cast the entire treasure of his human nature into his labor merely to please a part of the beholder, not merely to delight his senses, not merely to amuse his fancy, not merely to beguile him into emotion, not merely to lead him into thought, but to do all this. Senses, fancy, feeling, reason, the whole of the beholding spirit must be stilled in attention or stirred with delight, else the labouring spirit has not done its work well. For observe, it is not merely its right to be thus met, face to face, heart to heart, but it is its duty to evoke its answering of the other soul. Its trumpet call must be so clear, that though the challenge may by dullness or indolence be unanswered, there shall be no error as to the meaning of the appeal. There must be a summons in the work, which it shall be our own fault if we do not obey. We require this of it. We beseech this of it. Most men do not know what is in them, till they receive this summons from their fellows. Their hearts die within them, sleep settles upon them, the lethargy of the world's miasmata. There is nothing for which they are so thankful as for that cry, "Awake, thou that sleepest!" And this cry must be most loudly uttered to their noblest faculties, first of all to the imagination, for that is the most tender, and the soonest struck into numbness by the poisoned air, so that one of the main functions of art in its service to man is to arouse the imagination from its palsy, like the angel troubling the Bethesda pool, and the art which does not do this is false to its duty and degraded in its nature. It is not enough that it be well imagined, it must task the beholder also to imagine well, and this so imperatively, that if he does not choose to rouse himself to meet the work, he shall not taste it, nor enjoy it in any wise. Once that he is well awake, the guidance which the artist gives him should be full and authoritative. The beholder's imagination must not be suffered to take its own way, or wander hither and thither, but neither must it be left at rest. And the right point of realization, for any given work of art, is that which will enable the spectator to complete it for himself, in the exact way the artist would have him, but not that which will save him the trouble of effecting its completion. So soon as the idea is entirely conveyed, the artist's labor should cease, and every touch which he adds beyond the point when, with the help of the beholder's imagination, the story ought to have been told, is a degradation to his work. So that the art is wrong, which either realizes its subject completely, or fails in giving it such definite aid as shall enable it to be realized by the beholding imagination. It follows, therefore, that the quantity of finish or detail which may rightly be bestowed upon any work depends on the number and kind of ideas which the artist wishes to convey, much more than on the amount of realization necessary to enable the imagination to grasp them. It is true that the differences of judgment formed by one or another observer are in great degree dependent on their unequal imaginative powers, as well as their unequal efforts in following the artist's intention. And it constantly happens that the drawing which appears clear to the painter in whose mind the thought is formed, is slightly inadequate to suggest it to the spectator. These causes of false judgment or imperfect achievement must always exist, but they are of no importance. For in nearly every mind, the imaginative power, however unable to act independently, is so easily helped and so brightly animated by the most obscure suggestion, that there is no form of artistical language which will not readily be seized by it, if once it set itself intelligently to the task. And even without such effort, there are few hieroglyphics of which, once understanding that it is to take them as hieroglyphics, it cannot make itself a pleasant picture. Thus, in the case of all sketches, etchings, unfinished engravings, etc., no one ever supposes them to be imitations. Black outlines on white paper cannot produce a deceptive resemblance of anything, and the mind, understanding at once that it is to depend on its own powers for great part of its pleasure, sets itself so actively to the task that it can completely enjoy the rudest outline in which meaning exists. Now, when it is once in this temper, the artist is infinitely to be blamed who insults it by putting anything into his work which is not suggestive. Having summoned the imaginative power, he must turn it to account and keep it employed, or it will run against him in indignation. Whatever he does merely to realize and substantiate an idea is impertinent. He is like a dull storyteller, dwelling on points which the hearer anticipates or disregards. The imagination will say to him, "I knew all that before. I don't want to be told that. Go on, or be silent, and let me go on in my own way. I can tell the story better than you. Observe, then, whenever finish is given for the sake of realization, it is wrong. Whenever it is given for the sake of adding ideas, it is right. All true finish consists in the addition of ideas, that is to say, in giving the imagination more food, for once well awaked, it is ravenous for food. But the painter who finishes in order to substantiate takes the food out of its mouth, and it will turn and rend him. Let us go back, for instance, to our olive grove, or, lest the reader should be tired of olives, let it be an oak copse, and consider the difference between the substantiating and the imaginative methods of finish in such a subject. A few strokes of the pencil, or dashes of colour, will be enough to enable the imagination to conceive a tree, and in those dashes of colour Sir Joshua Reynolds would have rested, and would have suffered the imagination to paint what more it liked for itself, and grow oaks, or olives, or apples, out of the few dashes of colour at its leisure. On the other hand, Hobbema, one of the worst of the realists, smites the imagination on the mouth and bids it be silent, while he sets to work to paint his oak of the right green, and fill up its foliage laboriously with jagged touches, and furrow the bark all over its branches, so as, if possible, to deceive us into supposing that we are looking at a real oak, which indeed we had much better do at once, without giving any one the trouble to deceive us in the matter. End of conclusion, part 2. Conclusion, part 3 of the Stones of Venice, volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by MorganScorpion. The Stones of Venice, volume 3 by John Ruskin. Conclusion, part 3. Now, the truly great artist neither leaves the imagination to itself, like Sir Joshua, nor insults it by realization, like Hobbema, but finds it continual employment of the happiest kind. Having summoned it by his vigorous first touches, he says to it, "Here is a tree for you, and it is to be an oak. Now I know that you can make it green and intricate for yourself, but that is not enough. An oak is not only green and intricate, but its leaves have most beautiful and fantastic forms, which I am very sure you are not quite able to complete without help. So I will draw a cluster or two perfectly for you, and then you can go on and do all the other clusters. So far so good, but the leaves are not enough. The oak is to be full of acorns, and you may not be quite able to imagine the way they grow, nor the pretty contrast of their glossy almond-shaped nuts with the chasing of their cups. So I will draw a bunch or two of acorns for you, and you can fill up the oak with others like them. Good, but that is not enough. It is to be a bright day in summer, and all the outside leaves are to be glittering in the sunshine as if their edges were of gold. I cannot paint this, but you can. So I will really gild some of the edges nearer to you, and you can turn the gold into sunshine and cover the tree with it. Well done, but this is still not enough. The tree is so full-foliaged and so old that the wood-birds come in crowds to build there. They are singing, 2 or 3 under the shadow of every bough. I cannot show you them all, but here is a large one on the outside spray, and you can fancy the others inside. In this way the calls upon the imagination are multiplied as a great painter finishes, and from these larger incidents he may proceed into the most minute particulars, and lead the companion imagination to the veins in the leaves, and the mosses on the trunk, and the shadows of the dead leaves upon the grass, but always multiplying thoughts or subjects of thought, never working for the sake of realization. The amount of realization actually reached depending on his space, his materials, and the nature of the thoughts he wishes to suggest. In the sculpture of an oak tree, introduced above an adoration of the Magi on the tomb of the Doge Marco Dolfino, 14th century, the sculptor has been content with a few leaves, a single acorn, and a bird; while, on the other hand, Millet's willow tree with the robin in the background of his Ophelia, or the foreground of Hunt's Two Gentlemen of Verona, carries the appeal to the imagination into particulars so multiplied and minute that the work nearly reaches realization. But it does not matter how near realization the work may approach in its fullness, or how far off it may remain in its slightness, so long as realization is not the end proposed, but the informing one spirit of the thoughts of another. And in the greatness and simplicity of purpose, all noble art is alike, however slight its means, or however perfect, from the rudest mosaics of St. Mark's to the most tender finishing of the Huguenot or the Ophelia. Only observe, in this matter, that a greater degree of realization is often allowed, for the sake of color, than would be right without it. For there is not any distinction between the artists of the inferior and the nobler schools more definite than this, that the first color for the sake of realization, and the second realize for the sake of color. I hope that, in the 5th chapter, enough has been said to show the nobility of color, though it is a subject on which I would fain enlarge whenever I approach it, for there is none that needs more to be insisted upon, chiefly on account of the opposition of the persons who have no eye for color, and who, being therefore unable to understand that it is just as divine and distinct in its power as music, only infinitely more varied in its harmonies, talk of it as if it were inferior and servile with respect to the other powers of art, whereas it is so far from being this, that whenever it enters it must take the mastery, and whatever else is sacrificed for its sake, it at least must be right. This is partly the case even with music. It is at our choice whether we will accompany a poem with music or not, but if we do, the music must be right, and neither discordant nor inexpressive. The goodness and sweetness of the poem cannot save it if the music be harsh or false, but if the music be right, the poem may be insipid or inharmonious, and still saved by the notes to which it is wedded. But this is far more true of color. If that be wrong, all is wrong. No amount of expression or invention can redeem an ill-colored picture, while, on the other hand, if the color be right, there is nothing it will not raise or redeem, and therefore, wherever color enters at all, anything may be sacrificed to it, and, rather than it should be false or feeble, everything must be sacrificed to it, so that, when an artist touches color, it is the same thing as when a poet takes up a musical instrument. He implies in so doing that he is a master, up to a certain point, of that instrument, and can produce sweet sound from it, and is able to fit the course and measure of his words to its tones, which, if he be not able to do, he had better not have touched it. In like manner, to add colour to a drawing is to undertake for the perfection of a visible music, which, if it be false, will utterly and assuredly mar the whole work; if true, proportionately elevate it, according to its power and sweetness. But in no case ought the colour to be added in order to increase the realization. The drawing or engraving is aught that the imagination needs. To paint the subject merely to make it more real is only to insult the imaginative power and to vulgarize the whole. Hence the common though little understood feeling, among men of ordinary cultivation, that an inferior sketch is always better than a bad painting, although in the latter there may verily be more skill than in the former. For the painter who has presumed to touch colour without perfectly understanding it, not for the colour's sake, nor because he loves it, but for the sake of completion merely, has committed two sins against us. He has dulled the imagination by not trusting it far enough, and then, in this languid state, he oppresses it with base and false colour. For all colour that is not lovely is discordant. There is no mediate condition. So, therefore, when it is permitted to enter at all, it must be with a predetermination that, cost what it will, the colour shall be right and lovely. And I only wish that, in general, it were better understood that a painter's business is to paint primarily, and that all expression and grouping and conceiving, and what else goes to constitute design, are of less importance than colour in a coloured work. And so they were always considered in the noble periods, and sometimes all resemblance to nature whatever, as in painted windows, illuminated manuscripts, and such other work, is sacrificed to the brilliancy of colour, sometimes distinctness to form to its richness, as by Titian, Turner, and Reynolds, and, which is the point on which we are at present insisting, sometimes, in the pursuit of its utmost refinements on the surfaces of objects, an amount of realization becomes consistent with noble art, which would otherwise be altogether inadmissible, that is to say, which no great mind could otherwise have either produced or enjoyed. The extreme finish given by the pre-Raphaelites is rendered noble chiefly by their love of colour. So then, whatever may be the means, or whatever the more immediate end of any kind of art, all of it that is good agrees in this, that it is the expression of one soul talking to another, and is precious according to the greatness of the soul that utters it. And consider what mighty consequences follow from our acceptance of this truth. What a key we have herein given us for the interpretation of the art of all time. For as long as we held art to consist in any high manual skill, or successful imitation of natural objects, or any scientific and legalized manner of performance whatever, it was necessary for us to limit our admiration to narrow periods and to few men. According to our own knowledge and sympathies, the period chosen might be different, and our rest might be in Greek statues, or Dutch landscapes, or Italian Madonnas. But whatever our choice, we were therein captive, barred from all reverence but of our favourite masters, and habitually using the language of contempt towards the whole of the human race, to whom it had not pleased Heaven to reveal the arcana of the particular craftsmanship we admired, and who, it might be, had lived their term of 70 years upon the earth, and fitted themselves therein for the eternal world, without any clear understanding, sometimes even with an insolent disregard for the laws of perspective and chiaroscuro. But let us once comprehend the holier nature of the art of man, and begin to look for the meaning of the spirit, however syllabled, and the scene is changed, and we are changed also. Those small and dexterous creatures whom once we worshipped, those fur-capped divinities with sceptres of camel's hair, peering and poring in their one-windowed chambers over the minute preciousness of the laboured canvas, how are they swept away and crushed into unnoticeable darkness! And in their stead, as the walls of the dismal rooms that enclosed them, and us, are struck by the four winds of heaven, and rent away, and as the world opens to our sight, lo, far back into all the depths of time and forth from all the fields that have been sown with human life, how the harvest of the dragon's teeth is springing, how the companies of the gods are ascending out of the earth. The dark stones that have so long been the sepulchres of the thoughts of nations, and the forgotten ruins wherein their faith lay charnelled, give up the dead that were in them, and beneath the Egyptian ranks of sultry and silent rock, and amidst the dim golden lights of the Byzantine dome, and out of the confused and cold shadows of the northern cloister, behold, the multitudinous souls come forth with singing, gazing on us with the soft eyes of the newly comprehended sympathy, and stretching their white arms to us across the grave, in the solemn gladness of everlasting brotherhood. The other danger to which, it was above said, we were primarily exposed under our present circumstances of life, is the pursuit of vain pleasure, that is to say, false pleasure, delight which is not indeed delight, as knowledge vainly accumulated is not indeed knowledge. And this we are exposed to chiefly in the fact of our ceasing to be children. For the child does not seek false pleasure. Its pleasures are true, simple, and instinctive. But the youth is apt to abandon his early and true delight for vanities, seeking to be like men, and sacrificing his natural and pure enjoyments to his pride. In like manner, it seems to me that modern civilization sacrifices much pure and true pleasure to various forms of ostentation from which it can receive no fruit. Consider for a moment what kind of pleasures are open to human nature, undiseased. Passing by the consideration of the pleasures of the higher affections, which lie at the root of everything, and considering the definite and practical pleasures of daily life, there is, first, the pleasure of doing good, the greatest of all, only apt to be despised from not being often enough tasted. And then, I know not in what order to put them, nor does it matter, the pleasure of gaining knowledge, the pleasure of the excitement of imagination and emotion, or poetry and passion, and lastly, the gratification of the senses, first of the eye, then of the ear, and then of the others in their order. All these we are apt to make subservient to the desire of praise, nor unwisely when the praise sought is God's and the conscience's. But if the sacrifice is made for man's admiration, and knowledge is only sought for praise, passion repressed or affected for praise, and the arts practised for praise, we are feeding on the bitterest apples of Sodom, suffering always 10 mortifications for one delight. And it seems to me that in the modern civilized world we make such sacrifice doubly, first by laboring for merely ambitious purposes, and secondly, which is the main point in question, by being ashamed of simple pleasures, more especially of the pleasure in sweet colour and form, a pleasure evidently so necessary to man's perfectness and virtue, that the beauty of colour and form has been given lavishly throughout the whole of creation, so that it may become the food of all, and with such intricacy and subtlety that it may deeply employ the thoughts of all. If we refuse to accept the natural delight which the Deity has thus provided for us, we must either become ascetics, or we must seek for some base and guilty pleasures to replace those of paradise, which we have denied ourselves. Some years ago, in passing through some of the cells of the Grande Chartreuse, noticing that the window of each apartment looked across the little garden of its inhabitant to the wall of the cell opposite, and commanded no other view, I asked the monk beside me, why the window was not rather made on the side of the cell whence it would open to the solemn fields of the Alpine valley. "We do not come here," he replied, "to look at the mountains." The same answer is given, practically, by the men of this century to every such question. Only the walls with which they enclose themselves are those of pride, not of prayer. But in the Middle Ages it was otherwise. Not indeed in landscape itself, but in the art which can take the place of it, in the noble colour and form with which they illumined, and into which they wrought, every object around them that was in any wise subjected to their power. They obeyed the laws of their inner nature, and found its proper food. The splendour and fantasy even of dress, which in these days we pretend to despise, or in which, if we even indulge, it is only for the sake of vanity, and therefore to our infinite harm, were in those early days studied for love of their true beauty and honourableness, and became one of the main helps to dignity of character and courtesy of bearing. Look back to what we have been told of the dress of the early Venetians, that it was so invented, that in clothing themselves with it, they might clothe themselves also with modesty and honour. Consider what nobleness of expression there is in the dress of any of the portrait figures of the great times; nay, what perfect beauty, and more than beauty, there is in the folding of the robe round the imagined form even of the saint or of the angel. And then consider whether the grace of vesture be indeed a thing to be despised. We cannot despise it if we would, and in all our highest poetry and happiest thought we cling to the magnificence which in daily life we disregard. The essence of the modern romance is simply the return of the heart and fancy to the things in which they naturally take pleasure, and half the influence of the best romances, of Ivanhoe, or Marmion, or the Crusaders, or the Lady of the Lake, is completely dependent upon the accessories of armour and costume. Nay, more than this, deprive the Iliad itself of its costume, and consider how much of its power would be lost, and that delight and reverence which we feel in, and by means of, the mere imagination of these accessories, the Middle Ages had in the vision of them. the nobleness of dress exercising, as I have said, a perpetual influence upon character, tending in 1,000 ways to increase dignity and self-respect, and together with grace of gesture, to induce serenity of thought. I do not mean merely in its magnificence. The most splendid time was not the best time. It was still in the 13th century, when, as we have seen, simplicity and gorgeousness were justly mingled, and the leathern girdle and clasp of bone were worn, as well as the embroidered mantle, that the manner of dress seems to have been noblest. The chain mail of the knight, flowing and falling over his form in lapping waves of gloomy strength, was worn under full robes of one colour in the ground, his crest quartered on them, and their borders enriched with subtle illumination. The women wore first a dress close to the form in like manner, and then long and flowing robes, veiling them up to the neck, and delicately embroidered around the hem, the sleeves, and the girdle. The use of plate armour gradually introduced more fantastic types. The nobleness of the form was lost beneath the steel. The gradually increasing luxury and vanity of the age strove for continual excitement in more quaint and extravagant devices, and in the 15th century dress reached its point of utmost splendour and fancy, being in many cases still exquisitely graceful, but now in its morbid magnificence devoid of all wholesome influence on manners. From this point, like architecture, it was rapidly degraded, and sank through the buff coat and lace collar and jack boot to the bag-wig tailed coat and high-heeled shoes, and so to what it is now. Precisely analogous to this destruction of beauty in dress has been that of beauty in architecture, its colour and grace and fancy being gradually sacrificed to the base forms of the Renaissance, exactly as the splendour of chivalry has faded into the paltriness of fashion. And observe the form in which the necessary reaction has taken place. Necessary, for it was not possible that one of the strongest instincts of the human race could be deprived altogether of its natural food. Exactly in the degree that the architect withdrew from his buildings the sources of delight which in early days they had so richly possessed, demanding, in accordance with the new principles of taste, the banishment of all happy colour and healthy invention, in that degree the minds of men began to turn to landscape as their only resource. The picturesque school of art rose up to address those capacities of enjoyment for which, in sculpture, architecture, or the higher walks of painting, there was employment no more, and the shadows of Rembrandt and savageness of Salvator arrested the admiration which was no longer permitted to be rendered to the gloom or the grotesqueness of the Gothic aisle. And thus the English school of landscape, culminating in Turner, is in reality nothing else than a healthy effort to fill the void which the destruction of Gothic architecture has left. But the void cannot thus be completely filled, no, nor filled in any considerable degree. The art of landscape painting will never become thoroughly interesting or sufficing to the minds of men engaged in active life, or concerned principally with practical subjects. The sentiment and imagination necessary to enter fully into the romantic forms of art are chiefly the characteristics of youth, so that nearly all men as they advance in years, and some even from their childhood upwards, must be appealed to, if at all, by a direct and substantial art, brought before their daily observation and connected with their daily interests. No form of art answers these conditions so well as architecture, which, as it can receive help from every character of mind in the workman, can address every character of mind in the spectator, forcing itself into notice even in his most languid moments, and possessing this chief and peculiar advantage, that it is the property of all men. Pictures and statues may be jealously withdrawn by their possessors from the public gaze, and to a certain degree their safety requires them to be so withdrawn, but the outsides of our houses belong not so much to us as to the passer-by, and whatever cost and pains we bestow upon them, though too often arising out of ostentation, have at least the effect of benevolence. If then, considering these things, any of my readers should determine, according to their means, to set themselves to the revival of a healthy school of architecture in England, and wish to know in few words how this may be done, the answer is clear and simple. First, let us cast out utterly whatever is connected with the Greek, Roman, or Renaissance architecture in principle or in form. We have seen above that the whole mass of the architecture founded on Greek and Roman models, which we have been in the habit of building for the last 3 centuries, is utterly devoid of all life, virtue, honourableness, or power of doing good. It is base, unnatural, unfruitful, unenjoyable, and impious. Pagan in its origin, proud and unholy in its revival, paralyzed in its old age, yet making prey in its dotage of all the good and living things that were springing around it in their youth, as the dying and desperate king, who had long fenced himself so strongly with the towers of it, is said to have filled his failing veins with the blood of children. An architecture invented, as it seems, to make plagiarists of its architects, slaves of its workmen, and sybarites of its inhabitants. An architecture in which intellect is idle, invention impossible, but in which all luxury is gratified and all insolence fortified. The first thing we have to do is to cast it out, and shake the dust of it from our feet, for ever. Whatever has any connection with the 5 orders, or with any one of the orders, whether it is Doric, or Ionic, or Tuscan, or Corinthian, or Composite, or in any way Greekized or Romanized, whatever betrays the smallest respect for Vitruvian laws, or conformity with Palladian work, that we are to endure no more. To cleanse ourselves of these cast clouts and rotten rags is the first thing to be done in the court of our prison. Then, to turn our prison into a palace is an easy thing. We have seen above that, exactly in the degree in which Greek and Roman architecture is lifeless, unprofitable, and unchristian, in that same degree our own ancient Gothic is animated, serviceable, and faithful. We have seen that it is flexible to all duty, enduring to all time, instructive to all hearts, honourable and holy in all offices. It is capable alike of all lowliness and all dignity, fit alike for cottage porch or castle gateway, in domestic service familiar, in religious sublime, simple, and playful, so that childhood may read it, yet clothed with a power that can awe the mightiest and exalt the loftiest of human spirits. An architecture that kindles every faculty in its workman, and addresses every emotion in its beholder, which, with every stone that is laid on its solemn walls, raises some human heart a step nearer heaven, and which from its birth has been incorporated with the existence, and in all its form is symbolical of the faith of Christianity. In this architecture let us henceforward build, alike the church, the palace, and the cottage, but chiefly let us use it for our civil and domestic buildings. These once ennobled, our ecclesiastical work will be exalted together with them. But churches are not the proper scenes for experiments in untried architecture, nor for exhibitions of unaccustomed beauty. It is certain that we must often fail before we can again build a natural and noble Gothic. Let not our temples be the scenes of our failures. It is certain that we must offend many deep-rooted prejudices before ancient Christian architecture can be again received by all of us. Let not religion be the first source of such offence. We shall meet with difficulties in applying Gothic architecture to churches, which would in no wise affect the design of civil buildings, for the most beautiful forms of Gothic chapels are not those which are best fitted for Protestant worship. As it was noticed in the 2nd volume, when speaking of the Cathedral of Torcello, it seems not unlikely that as we study either the science of sound or the practice of the early Christians, we may see reason to place the pulpit generally at the extremity of the apse or chancel, an arrangement entirely destructive of the beauty of a Gothic church, as seen in existing examples, and requiring modifications of its design in other parts with which we should be unwise at present to embarrass ourselves. Besides, that the effort to introduce the style exclusively for ecclesiastical purposes excites against it the strong prejudices of many persons who might otherwise be easily enlisted amongst its most ardent advocates. I am quite sure, for instance, that if such noble architecture as has been employed for the interior of the church just built in Margaret Street had been seen in a civil building, it would have decided the question with many men at once, whereas at present it will be looked upon with fear and suspicion as the expression of the ecclesiastical principles of a particular party. But whether thus regarded or not, this church assuredly decides one question conclusively, that of our present capability of Gothic design. It is the first piece of architecture I have seen built in modern days which is free from all signs of timidity or incapacity. In general proportion of parts, in refinement and piquancy of mouldings, above all, in force, vitality, and grace of floral ornament, worked in a broad and masculine manner, it challenges fearless comparison with the noblest work of any time. Having done this, we may do anything. There need be no limits to our hope or our confidence. And I believe it to be possible for us not only to equal, but far to surpass in some respects any Gothic yet seen in northern countries. In the introduction of figure sculpture, we must, indeed, for the present remain utterly inferior, for we have no figures to study from. No architectural sculpture was ever good for anything which did not represent the dress and persons of the people living at the time, and our modern dress will not form decorations for spandrels and niches. But in floral sculpture we may go far beyond what has yet been done, as well as in refinement of inlaid work and general execution. For although the glory of Gothic architecture is to receive the rudest work, it refuses not the best, and when once we have been content to admit the handling of the simplest workman, we shall soon be rewarded by finding many of our simple workmen become cunning ones, and with the help of modern wealth and science, we may do things like Giotto's campanile, instead of like our own rude cathedrals, but better than Giotto's campanile, insomuch as we may adopt the pure and perfect forms of the northern Gothic, and work them out with the Italian refinement. It is hardly possible at present to imagine what may be the splendor of buildings designed in the forms of English and French 13th century surface Gothic, and wrought out with the refinement of Italian art in the details, and with a deliberate resolution, since we cannot have finger sculpture, to display in them the beauty of every flower and herb of the English fields, each by each, doing as much for every tree that roots itself in our rocks, and every blossom that drinks our summer rains, as our ancestors did for the oak, the ivy, and the rose. Let this be the object of our ambition, and let us begin to approach it, not ambitiously, but in all humility, accepting help from the feeblest hands, and the London of the 19th century may yet become as Venice without her despotism, and as Florence without her dispeace. End of conclusion, Part 3. End of the Stones of Venice, Volume 3, by John Ruskin.